and on behalf of our organization and our partners at NCSEA, CCL, and SACE, we're happy to have you. First of all, I want you to know that we're going to record this for posterity and for your benefit as well as ours.
Recording in progress.
Great. Welcome, and as I mentioned earlier, members of the media, as you join, please make sure that your name and your media outlet appears on your screen as an identifier. Thanks for doing that. That'll help us facilitate questions today during Simon's presentation. Again, I want to welcome you on behalf of CCBA, NCSEA, CCL, and SACE. We appreciate your interest in this issue. Grid reliability is a critical issue, and those who experience power losses as a result of blackouts over the Christmas weekend can attest firsthand to the challenges a lack of reliability caused them during the event. And there were other significant impacts to grid reliability across the region as a result of what happened that weekend. There was also a lot of misinformation around the event before the situation had even been evaluated. People diving into data, we think that diving into data and facts is helpful as we try to determine what actually happened and what might prevent this type of event from happening again. It's our hope that looking at the facts and the data with you will generate much needed conversation across the Southeast and the country about the types of energy market options that might serve customers in the Southeast better and provide better reliability in the future. Today, we'll hear how different types of electric generation fared during the storm, how government regulated monopolies performed versus competitive markets next door to us, and what needs to happen to improve reliability for our neighbors in the future. We're really grateful to have Simon Mahan with us this morning. Simon has, for more than 10 years, been the executive director of the Southern Renewable Energy Association. He spends much of his time focused on integrated resource planning processes and transmission planning. He's joining us this morning to share some of the analysis he's been doing on the blackouts with data provided by the Energy Information Administration, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, known as MISO, PJM, and others. It's compelling information, and we hope you'll find it helpful as you continue to cover this incident and its implications. We will take questions throughout Simon's presentation, so please use the raise hand feature or submit your questions in the chat, and we will attempt to get everyone's inquiries as we go along. At the conclusion of today's meeting, Julie will email each of you Simon's presentation and a recording of today's briefing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Simon. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Simon Mahan, and I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can you see that, Chris? Great.
Hi, Ms. Glassman. My name is Robert Rains, and I'm a parent in Washington, D.C. One of my friends recommended you as an attorney for special education children in the district. And I was wondering if I could just speak with you for a minute. My wife and I are looking for representation concerning our son's IEP.
Mr. Rains, you should probably mute your microphone.
Yeah, thank you. No worries. Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Mahan. As Chris said, I'm the executive director.
Some of these funds now.
Chris, you might want to mute everybody.
Are offering.
If everyone could take a moment to mute their microphones, that would be really handy.
Committed base salaries, like multi-year millions of pounds salary.
Okay. If we mute while we're viewing, that'll be easier for all of us, I think. I think we've got everybody now.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm the executive director of the Southern Renewable Energy Association. We're a nonprofit trade association of large-scale renewable developers.
Right.
And we focus on the Southeast, predominantly on MISO South, the Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, the TVA territory, and then Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And Winter Storm Elliott had impacts throughout the eastern portion of the United States. And I wanted to share and kind of start out with some slides from the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is a large grid operator in the middle part of the country, where they were comparing Winter Storm Elliott to Winter Storm Uri that happened just about 24 months ago. And as you can see from some of the weather data that MISO was sharing and some of the impacts that were occurring because of Winter Storm Elliott, Winter Storm Elliott looked quite similar to Uri. And the fact that Uri was a multi-day storm and Elliott was a multi-day storm really stood out to me as well. From Uri, there were multiple investigations into Texas, but of course, Uri impacted many other states besides Texas, even though Texas got most of the attention. I will say most of the attention on Texas was because Texas was so isolated from its neighbors. And I do want to preface the presentation here that will be one of the large stories coming out of Winter Storm Elliott, is that with better connections with our neighbors, we can avoid reliability problems. We can avoid blackouts like what we saw with Winter Storm Elliott. And similar to the isolation that Texas has with other parts of the grid, Tennessee Valley Authority and then the Carolinas need to be better connected with their neighbors in order to avoid blackouts like what we occurred over the December break. Similar data that were shared from MISO showed that fossil units like coal and natural gas power plants were not as reliable as what had been anticipated. And of course, over a couple of days, Winter Storm Elliott traveled from the western part of the United States over to the east, and the effects of that storm lingered for multiple days. But the impacts of Elliott, of course, were felt not only just by the cold, but because of the blackouts and the power outages. I do want to take a moment and note that you'll see on these maps, which are provided by an outlet called poweroutage.us. And what that company does is they collect power outage data directly from the utilities and then aggregate them up into these maps to show where individual power outages are occurring all across the United States. And what you can see is that the power outages really began on the 23rd or early in the 23rd, and then moved quickly across the United States into the 24th and on into the 25th. But there's really kind of two types of power outages broadly. First is kind of the distribution level power outages, where you may have winds or icing on your local power lines, trees falling on power lines, and those are tend to be smaller scale outages where a truck will roll and the utility will send out linemen to quickly repair those outages and fix those small scale problems. But the grid scale outages, what we saw with Winter Storm Uri and then also with the Tennessee Valley Authority and with Duke Energy, were grid scale outages where power plant failures, the inability to meet power demands, really affected large quantities of people simultaneously all across large regions. And so it's these two separate sizes of power outages that we're seeing here at the same time. And so you really need to know that while there's these two outages types going on at the same time, that they're two different levels of outages. Power Outage USA did post this helpful video kind of showing the storm and how it progressed, and I wanted to share it. And it may work on Zoom. If it doesn't, we'll provide this video so you can see it at a later time. But I wanted to share this, and so I'll go ahead and play this. What I'd like you to focus on is how the storm travels from the west to the east, You can see the individual counties, how the power outages occur kind of quickly, and then they're resolved relatively quickly. But with the outages that occur with TVA and Duke, they are swift and widespread, particularly on December 24th. So focus in on December 24th on the second day and on the TVA and Duke territories. And I'll go ahead and play this and hope that it works. It's just about a minute long. So you can see here that the storm starts out in the west. You can see some localized power outages, but quickly those counties start to fix their issues and the power comes back on. TVA does have a brief outage on December 23rd that they go through. You can see some outages throughout the eastern part of the US. But December 24th is the day that both TVA and Duke pretty quickly have major power outage problems almost at the same time. And you can see those pop up pretty brightly. And again, those data are provided directly from the utilities that then this company aggregates and then provides. So while the power outages were going on, the companies in the Southeast were importing significant amounts of power from their neighbors in order to prevent even more power outages from occurring. And so this map is provided by the Energy Information Administration. And I've provided a link down here. It's a publicly available link. And when we send out the presentation, you will be able to collect that link, access this link, and go back and view these data. So they're an interactive chart where you can hover over each individual bubble on this chart and see how much information is available from the Energy Information Administration. And then you can actually go through individual hours and replay the course of December 23rd on here. But I selected 1 p.m. As kind of an indicative hour on the 23rd to show you how much power was being imported into the Southeast at that given time. And at 1 p.m., these major grid operators, PJM, which is a large red dot, MISO, which is kind of a hazy dot over Iowa, both of those large grid operators are sending massive amounts of power into the Tennessee Valley Authority, into Duke, which is signaled here as DUK. But then you have all these smaller dots throughout the Southeast. That red dot on the eastern side of North Carolina, that is Duke Progress East. There's also a Duke Progress West that's represented by a dot. Santee Cooper is its own individual dot. Dominion, South Carolina is its own individual dot. And so what this chart is showing you is that we have a balkanized grid, a separated grid down here where each individual utility company is trying to maintain its own individual balance. Comparatively to the neighbors of PJM and MISO, they have significantly more power generation resources, many more power plants available to them to balance their loads in order to make sure that the lights stay on. And so if a utility in the Southeast runs into trouble, if they have a power plant that comes offline for whatever reason or can't get fuel, it makes it more difficult for our utilities in the South to get enough power to run. And so they have to import power from their neighbors, or sometimes, as we saw with the winter storm Elliott, those utilities have to go into these extreme measures of turning off power to their customers. And so, as you can see, I listed the amounts of power at 1 p.m. on the 23rd, how much power some of these companies were importing. And TVA was importing a significant amount of power in order to ensure that their lights were staying on for their customers at that time. As you move into 1 p.m. the next day on the 24th, which was an even more severe day where both TVA and Duke went into outages on that day, you still have significant amounts of power flowing into the southeastern region. And again, I've provided the link down below that will be available to folks after the call. Specifically on Duke, and we'll talk about TVA here in a moment, they reached what's called an energy emergency alert level 3, which is the highest level. And at an EEA 3, that's where power outages and rolling outages begin to occur. And so you can see from the chart here, which I was able to take a screenshot of at 9 o'clock on December 24th, you can see the significant power outages that were occurring throughout North Carolina, except that northeastern corner of North Carolina. So in that northeastern corner of North Carolina, that portion of the state is actually part of the PJM territory. And so while much of the state was under rolling blackouts, that corner that was part of PJM was not experiencing those rolling blackouts. As we saw from the charts previously, the Carolinas were importing PJM power during other times in order to try and ensure that power was staying on. Duke Energy was reporting that certain power plants, including Dan River, Roxborough, and Mayo, were derated, meaning that they were not operating at full output, at full capacity. And so these are fossil units that were not performing as expected. Meanwhile, the data that are available from the Energy Information Administration, which we'll show you here in a moment, perform quite well. There was a meeting from the North Carolina Utilities Commission where Duke representatives presented sort of their side of what happened. And they stated that Duke Carolinas was negatively impacting the Eastern Interconnection's frequency, the entire Eastern Interconnect. So the entire portion of the United States was being impacted by the low amount of generation and the high demand that Duke's customers were causing at that time. And then they compared that situation to the 2003 Northeast blackout risks. And that sort of comparison is really quite severe. So when a frequency of a particular system starts to decline too much, power stations are designed to turn off if frequency declines too far for too long. And if folks were following the Winter Storm Uri in Texas investigations, it came out of those investigations that Texas was within a certain number of minutes of entirely shutting down for a very long time. And that's what happened with the 2003 Northeastern blackouts, where for many days, the northeastern portion of the United States went offline for multiple days. And this is the situation that the Duke representatives were explaining, that they were negatively impacting the Eastern Interconnection's frequency to the North Carolina Utilities Commission. So the situation was really quite dire before they decided to start causing the rolling blackouts around December 24th. And so going back to the Energy Information Administration data, and again, these data are data provided directly from the utilities. They do cover more than just the Duke territory, the Duke system. They cover the entire balancing region. But just to orient you a little bit to the data, the solid blue line is how much power was actually consumed in that region at that time, whereas the light blue line is how much was forecasted to be needed at that particular time. And so you can pretty immediately see that late into the 23rd, early into the 24th, that this territory was under forecasting how much power they were needing. But the yellow line is how much generation, how much power they actually had on hand. And so you can see in December 24th that there was a gap. They had more power demand than what they had on supply. And so I've put here in a red box the timeline of when the power outages began around 6:15 a.m. To when the power outages ended around 4 p.m. on December 24th. And so you can see that there was about a 1.5 gigawatt gap of power through that day for Duke Energy Carolinas. Now, if you remember our earlier chart, the Duke system is bifurcated in the EIA data between Duke Carolinas, but also Duke Energy Progress East. There's also Duke Energy Progress West in the data. To make things a little simpler, I just provided the Duke Energy Progress East because it's the larger of the systems. But when you move over to the Duke Energy Progress East data, you can see that there was an even more significant gap in the amount of power needed, which again was the blue line, and the power available, which was the yellow line. And so the green line is what comes into play here, which is the power imports for the region. And so it was really important for Duke to be able to import power and move power around to ensure that things weren't going to get worse over time. You'll note here as well that while they were doing rotating outages just on December 24th, you'll note into December 25th, Duke Energy Progress East still had significant power demand into December 25th. So they were still struggling to keep the power up and running and needing significant amounts of power that they were unable to generate for Duke Energy Progress East. And through the Duke Energy meeting that happened at the North Carolina Utilities Commission a few weeks ago, the Duke Energy representative said that they didn't enter into normal operations until something like December 26th at 11 a.m. So this was a multi-day event where it was really difficult for the company to come back from the power outages and the power generation failures that occurred. But the data from EIA also provide more information about the generation at the time. And so here you can see the individual types of generation from the coal units, which are in kind of this dark brown color, the natural gas units, which are in this lighter brown color, the nuclear units in this maroon color, this solid red line up at the top. And of course, I've overlaid the timing of the outages in this red box as well on December 24th. And so, and the hydro units in blue. And so you can see during the outages, solar performed exceptionally well. And so had it not been for solar power on December 24th, the Duke Energy Carolina system would have been in even more dire straits. And so solar performed quite well right when it was needed. And anyone that went through these storms know that those days were really quite sunny. And so it was really important for solar to be there during that time. And also looking at these data, you can pretty well see that the natural gas units, the light gray line here, right under the nuclear units, were not performing at their top level. And so the fact that you've got solar performing quite well and the natural gas units not performing as well is one bit of information that you can glean from these EIA data pretty well. Again, you have to look at the Duke Energy Progress data as well, and you see a similar story where the natural gas units, the light gray lines, are not performing very well. The coal units are actually performing even worse, where they're not providing a steady stream of power. But the available solar generation units are generating quite well during this time that the power outages are being called directly by Duke. You'll also notice that there's a new purple line here, the petroleum units. During this time, across the eastern part of the United States, the amount of natural gas consumption was so high that PJM MISO, many of the utilities that I've heard report on what was going on, the natural gas supply was in such high demand that the pipeline pressure in many of the pipelines started to decline. And as that pipeline pressure started to decline, many of the power stations and the power companies started to switch over from natural gas to burning oil. And in some cases, that's very unusual. And so when you switch
to record something, so it's like full screen right here, you go to here.
Okay.
So when you switch over from a natural gas power fuel source to a petroleum fuel source, that can be a difficult switch. And so what you can even see sometimes in these data during this time, even those petroleum power stations didn't quite perform as expected. You can even see a little bit of a dip in the output from those petroleum units, even in these data, right when Duke needed those power stations to perform as expected. There's additional data from Energy Information Administration regarding the imports and the exports, how the power was flowing into and out of the Carolinas. These charts are rather messy because, again, you're relying on multiple balkanized grids to pull power in, to push power out. And here you can see on the top part, so when the numbers are positive, a company is exporting power, and when the numbers are negative, the company is importing power. And so here, Duke Energy Carolinas was exporting power to their subsidiary, their sister company, Duke Energy Progress East, during the blackouts, but they were importing power from Santee Cooper. So they were trying to keep power going from Santee Cooper in order to prevent things from going worse. Duke Energy Progress at the time, you can see their imports coming from Duke, but then they were exporting some power to, it looks like PJM at this time. And so that's an unusual thing to see here. But what I think what was going on was the system was so taxed and was so overburdened that there may have been something what's called loop flow, where power traveling from one region is rapidly moving from one region into another and then traveling across multiple areas all at the same time. And as I mentioned before, while the data are provided by the utilities, these data are preliminary and not quite solid. As I was traveling and looking through some of these data, some of the data weren't quite adding up. And so I contacted the Energy Information Administration, and they admitted that some of the data aren't quite firm yet. And so when you look at the data provided by PJM, the information looks a little bit different. Here's the information provided by PJM. It's a little messy. They include information all the way from New York. And so if you clean up the information a little bit more and you focus in on what was happening from PJM's perspective into the region, PJM was providing a significant amount of power into TVA, into Duke, into the Carolinas, into the Duke Progress East, Duke Progress West, before the power outages were called by the Carolinas. But then around noontime, it looks like the power from PJM stops, and then it picks back up at a later time. So this is one of the mysteries that we don't have answers on yet. We need to find out what was going on during that time in order to better fill in the answers of what was going on. But from this chart, you can very clearly see, at least from PJM's perspective, they were sending a significant amount of power into the Carolinas even before the power outages were called into the Carolinas. And they were sending a significant amount of power into TVA at the time as well. One other thing that could have been happening during these levels where it looks like PJM had less amounts of power flowing into the region, is if things were so dire, as Duke was explaining to the North Carolina Utilities Commission, PJM may have predetermined that it was more important to cut off the Carolinas in order to save the Eastern Interconnect. But we don't know that for sure. And so these are questions that need to be asked from the North Carolina Utilities Commission at PJM. And then also there's a current Federal Energy Regulatory Commission investigation alongside with the National Energy Reliability Council investigation. So we don't know exactly what was going on at this particular time just yet, but stay tuned. Hopefully we'll find out. Moving on to the Tennessee Valley Authority, similar to Duke, they reached an EEA3, but on two separate occasions. They reached it on Friday, December 23rd, for a couple of hours, but their more extreme event was again on December 24th, from 4:51 a.m. to 10:31 a.m. And so it may seem like a little bit of a time shift, but these are in central time periods. And so if you shift the time based on the Eastern time zone versus the Central time zone, they almost exactly interact pretty well with what was happening over at Duke at the same time. They were importing, according to the EIA data, which we'll see here in a moment, over 5 gigawatts of power from MISO. TVA has reported that their coal units, Bull Run and the Cumberland coal units, were struggling at times. They either went offline entirely or were derated. And then TVA is also opening their own investigation. These are similarly pulled from the, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Simon, we wondered if you could just briefly explain what an EEA3 is for members of our audience.
Yeah, sure. So, I figured I'd get this question. So when we send out the slides here, I've included a fact sheet on what that is from the California Independent System Operator to better explain it. An EEA is an energy emergency alert. And so there's 3 levels. An EEA1 is the lowest level, an EEA2 is next, and then the EEA3 is where you go into actively shedding load or going through a blackout. These are official NERC alerts that utilities go through whenever they are in emergency situations in order to preserve the reliability of the grid at large. And so when you reach an EEA3 and particularly a load shedding event, that's where you start to have blackouts. It's the highest level of a reliability problem in a particular utility region. But I've included a better EEA explainer in the notes section in these PowerPoint slides, so folks can read more about those when at their leisure.
Oh, it's serious. Thanks very much.
So TVA was importing significant amounts of power from MISO, even during their outage and rolling blackout problems on December 23rd and then into December 24th. But they continued their imports from MISO for many, many days. While at the same time, they were exporting a fair amount of power, I'll say, over to Southern Company. So SoCo is Southern Company. Southern Company operates in Georgia, Alabama, and also in Mississippi as well. And so you'll see here as well, you can see in the yellow line, PJM is represented as well. So TVA was pulling power from PJM and MISO on December 23rd, but that still wasn't enough from them to go into a rolling blackout situation on December 23rd. So on December 23rd, TVA was struggling to ramp up their natural gas units. That's the light gray line. You can see on December 23rd, those natural gas units did not ramp up as quickly as what they needed to in order to serve the load. You can also see that the coal units were not as high operating as what they could have been, because earlier in December 23rd, the coal units were near 5,000 megawatts of operation, and then they stepped down pretty considerably, and then they never stepped back up. And so you can see that the coal units turn off, but then they never turn back on over multiple days. And so you can pretty clearly see that there are significant problems. And then moving into December 24th, the coal units again are not there. And then the natural gas units, when TVA needs them to be online, actually start to decline in availability. And at the same time, though, the solar, the very little solar that TVA has available in their footprint was available. And again, very similar to the Carolinas and even here in Arkansas, these were very sunny days. And so it's a really important thing to note that during the blackout times, had more solar been available, it would have been more helpful and useful to either shorten the length of the blackouts or make them less severe. And so adding more solar would have been helpful at these times. Here's TVA's data from EIA showing that they had very significant gaps in the amount of power that they needed, which was the dark blue lines, and the amount of power that they had on hand, which again were the yellow lines. And so on the 23rd, they had about a 7 gigawatt gap, which is a very significant amount of power. And from the green line, you can see that they had to import a significant amount of power in order to make up for that lack of power in order to meet their demand. But even with that import, they weren't able to fully meet their demand, and they still had to go into a rolling blackout situation. So with that overview of what was going on just with Duke and TVA, there's still more stories to be told, specifically about Louisville Gas and Electric, with Southern Company, with Santee Cooper, with utilities down in Florida. But we only have an hour to talk here. But I did want to note that we've seen this story before. In 2014, there was a polar vortex, and there was an official FERC and NERC investigation where data from that storm came out and showed that the Carolinas reached significantly more power need than what was available. And then TVA and the rest of the Southeast was impacted as well. And at that time, SCE&G, which is now Dominion, South Carolina, had controlled firm load shed. That's the official industry term for blackouts. And at that time as well, Duke activated a 5% system-wide voltage reduction, which is a step right before you get into, again, blackouts. And so back in 2014, we had this similar situation with a winter storm that caused significant problems in the Southeast. In 2018, we had another winter storm that there was another NERC investigation, FERC NERC investigation, that saw significant power generation problems in the Southeast that led to gas pipeline pressure problems, that led to multiple outages of power plants in our region. So we, again, 4 years later, we saw these problems happen again. And then with Winter Storm Uri, most of the focus was on what happened in Texas because that's where the storm landed. But Winter Storm Uri had impacts here in the Southeast. And that FERC NERC investigation just last year saw that TVA call a TLR level 3, a transmission load relief, which is basically an event where TVA cut off power flows into MISO, and it effectively created a energy crisis in MISO South, or the Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi region of MISO, because TVA didn't have enough power to serve their own load. And so our region in the Southeast has been impacted by these winter storms multiple times over the past decade, and we should have been more prepared. We've seen it before. It's happened before. This isn't an unusual thing. It's just that this storm had a more direct bullseye on our region than some of these other storms. And hopefully will pay a bit more attention this time. But even before the storm, the National Electric Reliability Council issued a warning in November of 2022 saying that SERC, which is the Southeastern Electric Reliability Council, that's our region, the southeastern portion, said that the southeast portion, like Texas, extreme cold could result in higher generator outages and demand volatility, and a rare cold event in the South could result in an energy emergency in this area. And it specifically called out the Carolinas. And they made this prediction in November. And then SERC had even issued a warning in September, a few months prior, and said that extreme cold weather can cause disruptions in the fuel supply. And so we've been aware of these problems for many years. The warnings were made many months in advance, but we were just not made prepared. And then with the storm in particular, ERCOT, which is the grid operator in Texas, was issuing warnings about the storm as early as December 16th. And then gas pipeline operators were also issuing warnings about the storm as early as December 16th as well. And so we had more than a week of warning to prepare. And then the neighboring grid operators as well were also issuing warnings and conservation notices warnings as well. But we weren't getting those types of warnings and notifications in much of the Southeast, even though everybody else, it seemed, was getting much more prepared for it. Some quick notes from the other regions. MISO, and I've mentioned MISO a number of times. Here's the chart from MISO showing that during the storm, MISO had a significant amount of wind power online that was operating quite well. And so you have this nice green line showing that wind was performing quite well. PJM, they had high prices, but their thermal power generation was struggling, which is why the power prices went up pretty high. And in SPP, which is a grid operator even further to the west of MISO, they had a significant amount of wind power that was operating as well. But here in the Southeast, we don't have a major market like an SPP, a MISO, or a PJM. But instead, what we have is something called the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market, which is a fairly new market. And it matches up buyers and sellers between all these different utilities in order to sell energy. But the data available from the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market show that SEAM during this emergency situation, SEAM was not helpful. One of the most interesting things, I think, from the data available from the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market was, of course, it sort of makes sense that there weren't as many sellers of power during December 24th. And that makes sense to me. But what doesn't make sense is that there weren't as many buyers. And so there should have been more willing purchasers of energy on December 24th than what there were. But instead, it shows that the market had even less purchasers on December 24th than the day before. When you're in an emergency situation like this, you would expect for more power companies to be wanting more power and to use this tool to try and purchase energy. But the data really show on an hourly basis, the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market, which is just made up of the utilities here in the Southeast, was not used nearly at all from December 23rd almost all the way to December 27th, which is a highly unusual problem. When you have an emergency like this, and you're supposed to have a market where you should be able to trade power back and forth with your neighbors in the Southeast, and there are no trades being made at all. And so what these charts are showing is individual trades being made on an hour-by-hour basis. And so what I've done here is I've highlighted there are no trades being made on December 23rd for many, many hours. And there are no trades at all being made on December 24th, 25th, or 26th, which is highly unusual that there are no trades at all with this market mechanism. The data are publicly available and you can collect them, but you have to sign in and collect them from the Southeastern Energy Exchange market.
Hey, Simon, as we are at Q&A time, oh, great, you're at conclusions. And so please either raise a hand or get your question ready if you've got a question for Simon right after this. Thanks.
Looks like Jeff St. John has a question, Chris and Simon.
Okay.
Yeah, let me run through my conclusions here real quick, and then we'll move into Q&A. So just for some conclusions, solar and wind performed quite well during Winter Storm Elliott. We saw the data that solar performed well in the Southeast. Without the wind from MISO being imported into the Southeast, it would have been very difficult to keep the lights on as well as what we did here in the Southeast. We saw data showing that the coal, the oil, and the natural gas resources did struggle in the Southeast and in other regions. The regional transmission organizations around the Southeast really did prevent worse power outages by exporting their power into our region. And so more regional and interregional transmission connections would be helpful for our region if another event like this were to occur in the future. And the data also showed that the Southeastern Energy Exchange market was not helpful during this time at all. There was some power that could have been purchased, but because of the way the Southeastern Energy Exchange market works, there was not any way for that power to match up and be sold throughout the region. And then finally, there are some investigations that are ongoing, but the data currently that we have are limited, they're preliminary, and we need more investigations from our state public service commissions, from the federal regulators, and the regional organizations that have the data. And we need those data to be publicly available so we can get a better sense of what actually happened. And with that, I am concluded with my presentation, and here's my contact information. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thanks so much, Simon. We appreciate you developing all that material and reading it so that we don't have to. But it's really very helpful to have the conclusions. I think our first question is from Jeff St. John at Canary Media.
Thank you for this, Simon. I raised my hand because I wanted to ask a particular question about SEAM, but I should probably open with a more general question, which is essentially what recommendations the participants, stakeholders have as to what can and should be done about this situation that could be at the, I guess, well, there are so many that I daren't start listing them right now, but certainly I would invite all the participants to lay out ways in which they've proposed policy, regulatory, technical solutions to these problems in the past that are relevant still in light of this information. And those can be at the kind of state level, or they could be at the kind of regional level. There may well be some particular concerns or critiques of the SEAM market structure that are relevant to this. Let me just keep it broad and let you guys tell us what you think is most important to highlight.
So, I mean, a way to think about that might be, and Simon, you might want to take down your screen so we can see the folks we're talking with. A way to think about that might be to think about what happened in all of the areas that did not lose power and why they did not lose power. So PJM next to us, MISO, et cetera. Simon, what would you say were the key differences between, say, a PJM and a MISO and then the government regulated monopolies?
Yeah, I think the fact that you've got resource diversification, so a significant amount of renewable resources online and available, larger regional geographic footprint so that you're able to better balance the region, and better transmission connection, so better regional and interregional transmission connection, which really relies on better transmission planning, which throughout the Southeast, we've really struggled with good regional and interregional transmission planning for a very, very long time. And so within each one of those recommendations, there's a whole lot of things that could be done to improve resource diversification, transmission planning, transmission expansion. But those are some of the key differences that the regions next to us have that we need in our region. And it's very similar to Texas, where Texas does not have robust interregional transmission. Texas does not have the level of resource diversification that they need in order to avoid the power outages that they had. They relied very heavily on natural gas and fossil units. And so we've seen the story before out of Uri, and we can, I think, apply some of those lessons learned there to here.
I think thank you, Simon. And I would add to that, Duke really, in their presentation to the North Carolina Utilities Commission on January 3rd, they kept saying, well, PJM didn't give us the power we needed. PJM didn't give us the power they needed. And if they would have been members of PJM, then of course they would have received that power because PJM prioritizes its members. It has to legally. But at the same time, Duke doesn't want to join PJM or be part of any market. And so it wants to isolate, and its central argument is always, A, we need control, and B, natural gas is reliability. And I think we've seen now very clear examples that it's not necessarily in control, and natural gas is reliable a lot of the time, but it's not infallible at all. South Carolina, I think, as a number of you know, is pretty close to having a study released by the Brattle Group, which will have analyzed South Carolina's possible moves toward utility reform and market reform. And that'll be released, I think, in the next couple of weeks. And it's part of a legislative package that South Carolina passed 2 years ago to consider exactly how South Carolina can improve so that it doesn't go through this. I think WRAL has had its hand up a few times. Folks from WRAL, do you have a question? Jeff, did you have follow-up questions? I see.
Yeah, if you guys don't mind double dipping.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
How does any of this relate to the ongoing issue of Duke's carbon plan and kind of associated integrated resource planning as pertains to its desire to build a lot of gas plants? I have no idea how the kind of reliability of gas plants during winter cold snaps is calculated as part of the overall process of determining how much new gas Duke ought to or needs to build to maintain reliability. I don't know where those two things come together.
Well, I think that's part of, what Simon was saying about Duke essentially and us being like Texas. Because Duke is an island when it comes to energy, then the response to a situation like this is, we've got to build more, we've got to build more. It's not, hey, let's connect with a pack of states next door that don't have blackouts and that have a lot of energy on the market. And you ask a great question that I think would put a lot of people to sleep who are not regulators. But, in the carbon plan, when Duke talks about reliability, they don't factor in renewables at all. So when they're doing planning, it basically boosts the value of gas in their model, because they're saying, well, solar can't do anything for us and wind can't do anything for us unless, it's blowing. The carbon plan does have a provision for energy storage, which I think all of our organizations hosting this have supported strongly. And energy storage, of course, has gotten very cheap. It's a technology the same way solar and wind have become the cheapest generators. And it would allow solar and wind to generate in the dark or when there's not a windy day going on. So I think that's an important thing for everybody to press on. And energy storage doesn't have to be powered by solar; it could be powered by the grid. And, I think the other thing that Simon's presentation showed is that solar did play a critical role on those days, Christmas Eve day and Christmas, when the sun was out, specifically in recharging large hydro storage that Duke had depleted. So I think there's always a desire on the part of government monopoly utilities to build the most expensive gold-plated infrastructure they can possibly build. And the reason for that is they've got a government guaranteed return on investment of about 11% in Duke's case. So they want to build the most expensive stuff because the cheapest stuff, the least expensive options don't generate as much profit.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that, so most of my work is on integrated resource plans, and this isn't just a problem in the Carolinas, but a lot of the IRPs that I've worked with in Southern Territory, with TVA, with Louisville Gas and Electric, with Entergy, they really focus on natural gas as a summertime resource and don't really focus on the wintertime. And when they do that, oftentimes the integrated resource plan models will assume that natural gas is always available. But as we've seen through the NERC-FERC investigations over the multiple years with Winter Storm Elliott, sometimes the amount of gas demand is so high that the natural gas pressure on the entire system in the entire eastern portion of the United States becomes so low that you effectively can't use that natural gas power plant that you assumed in the models would be effectively 100% there. And so by adding more natural gas power plants to a system that effectively is burnt out, that you can't get enough gas to, you are exacerbating that problem. You are making it worse because you think you're solving a problem, but you are trying to draw more natural gas out exactly when all of your neighbors are trying to do exactly the same thing. And so again, it's exceptionally important to diversify your energy resources. Use wind, use solar, use battery storage, work on interregional and regional transmission to connect to your neighbors so that you have a larger scale transmission system that is less affected by the weather. And by doing those things, energy efficiency, demand response, these are additional tools in the tool belt to try and avoid significant weather events that aren't adequately captured in a lot of the integrated resource planning models that I see across the region.
Thanks. Other questions? Yep.
If I might add there, to sort of answer Jeff's question a little bit from the perspective of those of us who were involved in the carbon plan process and in multiple IRPs, the modeling that Duke did to support the carbon plan capped the amount of solar that it planned to add to the grid over the next several years. It did that on the grounds of constraints in transmission, which is in some sense true. But what it ended up doing was pushing down a readily available and less expensive power supply in exchange for gas and other technologies, using the excuse that the transmission grid is not ready for the amount of injection that solar would have to do in these parts of the state. So it really underscores, as does the blackout, how important transmission planning and transmission reform is. It could get us more power from outside the area if we were involved in a regional organization. That would help that as well. But the transmission grid may not be prepared for these types of events or for the amount of cheap and reliable power that we are ready to put onto the system. And so the transmission planning and transmission improvement is vitally important, Jeff.
Thanks, John. Do we have reporters' questions? And it looks like we might have comments from Maggie at SACE and Eddie. Any reporter questions? Maggie, did you have a thought to share?
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think that transmission both in the region and connecting to other regions would be vitally important in these kinds of situations, as well as solar and wind resources. I think that especially if we think about when this occurred and the fact that it was probably primarily driven by residential heating load. I mean, this is Christmas Eve primarily. It's not a lot of industrial and commercial businesses most likely driving this load. And I think it's really important to mention that energy efficiency plays a key role. There are a lot of areas in this region that have very inefficient electric heating and homes that lack good or even any insulation at all, mobile homes and these sorts of things. So energy efficiency programs are definitely part of a resilient solution to not having to do this in the future with this kind of weather. Thanks.
Thanks, Maggie. Eddie, did you have a comment?
Well, I wanted to go back to Jeff's first question, which is what do we recommend?
Yeah.
And I think it's obvious from the presentation that having the various southeastern states participate in an actual organized wholesale market so that some entity has purview over that region and promotes reliability and cost savings over that region. That's ultimately what we're talking about here. The political reality is that's not going to happen by waving a wand. And so what's the next step? I think the next step is neighboring states like North Carolina and Georgia need to take the same step that South Carolina is taking, which is to seriously study this issue. In other words, get a technically valid evaluation of what the benefits to the people of the state would be from participation in this type of market. And so usually, today's present focusing on a reliability issue and on reliability. This issue of regional coordination is usually pursued from the perspective of getting cost savings. And so those two things are very connected. It's possible to gain reliability by building more and more and more duplicate transmission and pipelines, and hopefully overrun the gas drilling side. They're drilling enough gas to put in the pipeline and those pipes don't freeze. The reality is that's not ultimately the reliability answer. It's also not the cost answer. So what we're saying is you can get more reliability and less cost by more effectively using the resources we have, more effectively operating them, and more effectively planning changes to them. But if you think about it, South Carolina alone does not have the jurisdiction to plan a better connection on the Georgia side of the line. And Georgia doesn't have the jurisdiction to plan a better connection on the South Carolina side of the line. You have to create a regional entity for that purpose that has those powers and capabilities.
If I can, Chris, I'd also note that the answer is to the problem posed by this winter storm event is not to build more of the technologies that failed in this winter storm event. It's to diversify our supply and fix our transmission issues. I mean, that's really, this event exposed the weak underbelly of the Duke system. And the other problem they had, which was in Simon's graph, was how off their projections were. And I think that the Duke representatives who spoke to the Utilities Commission were admirably frank about that. They said they missed it. They admitted that they missed it. That doesn't change the fact that they missed it. And we have to figure out why those models, which they relied on in their power purchasing and getting their units ready, and is the same type of modeling they use in their IRP forecasts and in their carbon plan forecasts, were so off.
Questions? Any other reporter questions? I did see a meteorologist on here earlier. Going once.
Looks like David Borax has a question.
Oh, great. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see that hand. Go
Hey,
ahead.
thanks. Thanks so much for the presentation. Really enlightening. Can you say a little bit more about what you think went wrong with SEAM?
There's no there. That's how I would describe it. I mean, it's designed to do so little in the first place. I mean, it is sort of there just isn't much to it. But Simon, do you want to talk about the giant sort of holes in activity that you presented? And it looks like Maggie might have a comment on this too.
Yeah, well, so the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market, they are supposed to have a monthly auditor report that comes out. The monthly auditor report for November came out last month on the 22nd. And so I've been checking the website every day to see if the report for December is out yet. And as of this morning, it's not. And so I'm eagerly waiting to see what the independent auditor has to say what happened in December of last year to get some sort of additional information about what happened. But the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market is not an independent system operator. They are a market of the utilities design. They do not have independent governance. They are not a transparent market like MISO, like PJM. And so we have to rely on the data that they provide through their own portal. They don't provide their data to the Energy Information Administration. And so we are really dependent on them providing their own data through their own portal. And I will also mention that a few days after the storm, I went to go collect data from their web portal, and a lot of the data were missing. And it took many days, many weeks for the data to populate. And even a couple of days ago, there were data that were missing from the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market. And so it's not a transparent thing, and it's really difficult to get any sense of what actually happened there. And none of the state regulators have any oversight into the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market. And so there's no way for them to open an investigation into SEAM. And the only way for anyone to find anything out is for FERC to ask what happened. And so unfortunately, none of us on this call can provide anything beyond what is presented in the data or what the independent auditor is going to provide in their report. But I will also note that the quote unquote independent auditor was also selected by the utilities. And so there are just multiple problems with the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market where there's not enough transparency for us to be able to say what definitively happened, because it doesn't even tell you what type of power was being available to be sold or who the buyers and the sellers were potentially. But regardless, power was being offered. There were purchasers, but there were no matches. And without the matches, no power was able to flow. And so there was this potential opportunity where things didn't have to be as bad as what they were. You could have potentially flowed some power through SEAM if the prices were right. But because it's entirely voluntary, it was not helpful at all for many days, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I mean, I agree with everything that Simon said. He hit the nail on the head there. I mean, SEAM did not help at all in this situation. SEAM also operated completely as designed in this situation. It is not designed for these types of situations. It relies on voluntary offering of excess power and free transmission from point A to B. And I mean, with everything going on, I'm not surprised that none of the matches were able to be made under the circumstances that that SEAM is operated under, which were crafted so that SEAM would have a very particular type of oversight. At least in my opinion, I think the way that SEAM was crafted, it's to avoid a whole lot of oversight from both the state and the federal level, because it's not anywhere near what we see in an ISO RTO region. So that's my point. It was not helpful, but also it was not a breakdown. It was operating completely as the utilities have designed it.
Thanks.
If I could, I think that's a really good point. It wasn't designed to perform this particular function that we're talking about. It's aimed at something different, so it's not surprising. And I think really we're not trying to be critical of any utility. If you think back to that first, the personnel and the management did heroic efforts to avoid a worse blackout. And to some degree, we succeeded in avoiding the Eastern Interconnect going down. I think what we're pointing out, if you go back to the very first picture of the size of that storm and the size of Uri, there's no individual utility territory that can grapple with that type of reliability event effectively. It takes something with a bigger footprint, with a bigger map in the control room. And the weather is changing, and if we keep doing the same thing we've done before, we won't dodge the bullet next time. So we are saying there's a reliability imperative to take regional coordination more seriously.
That's great. Other questions?
I hate to triple dip, but if
Sure.
I may, this is Jeff St. John of Canary Media.
We're here for.
Yeah, I'm just wondering on the kind of gas and reliability issue, who makes the IRP modeling software or platform that can tell you when the next marginal unit of new natural gas generation will not be useful for increasing reliability due to all the issues that you guys have raised? And where do we have regulators who might be in a position to require the utilities they regulate to use said modeling software?
Well, yeah, that's a great and interesting question, Jeff. And just a couple quick thoughts on it. Duke mentioned in its presentation on January 3rd a vendor that works with many utilities, and that software had the same problem with a number of utilities. We don't know who that is. Certainly FERC, but I think also the state commissions have the authority to answer or to ask that question. I think Commissioner Duffley actually did ask quite a few detailed questions and asked Duke to get back to the commission on that. Of course, that is information for the commission, and it would be great if it were a public discussion. I think the other thing that's interesting about the software and the incident is, frequently, if you have a hurricane, then it's taking lines down. And so utilities will say, well, our lines were down and we can't control that. But as Simon's presentation pointed out, some of the other regional generation and transmission areas said a week, 10 days out, this is a serious temperature event that's coming. And this was not a hurricane. So of the 500,000 North Carolinians who were denied power over Christmas, only about 35,000 of them lost power due to downed lines from wind. And everyone else was subject to malfunction at Duke gas plants, to the software issue and other things. So I'd say the commissions have the power to at least ask those questions, and certainly the feds have the power to change practice. I think Zach from EE News just raised his hand a moment ago. Zach, are you still with us? Looks like we might have missed Zach. Any other questions for the good of the order? Jeff, you want a quadruple dip?
Sure. Thank you
It's
for
fine
the
with us.
opportunity. I guess what happens next with this? What are the kind of regulatory venues and processes by which all the problems you've identified and the potential solutions to them may be addressed? It's kind of expansive, but maybe the top ones on your list.
Yeah, and I'd invite Eddie to jump in on this too. I think the study that will come out in South Carolina will have, I think, several relevant features to this conversation. One will be about excess megawattage that would be generated by South Carolina being a member of a market. And we already know that the savings for being part of a wholesale market would be substantial. I think, and then as someone asked about the carbon plan earlier, that will continue to relate to this discussion also. So, will we proceed down a path where we build more and more and more stuff, more plants in North Carolina, when we have energy from 15 states across the border that could be shared with us if we were a part of that? Eddie, did you have other thoughts to address that question?
Looks like David has a question as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah, just a little.
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just a quick follow-up. So we've been told that there was no energy to buy. So I just want to clarify, if there was more regional cooperation, how would that have solved North Carolina's problem?
So there was no energy to buy because in Duke's case, and I think in the case of the utilities in South Carolina as well, since they weren't in PJM, they weren't in the market, they weren't prioritized. PJM did not have blackouts. So it had the power, but it had to give its members the first shot at that power. And, Duke spokespeople kind of pointed their fingers on January 3rd and said, well, we had a hard contract for this that we got at the last minute, and it was 1,000 megawatts. But, simply they weren't part of the larger regional pattern. And so they're second in line for that.
If I could add to that a little bit, when power generation is part of a regional market instead of each utility dispatching the plants locally, you use the available resources more effectively overall. The sum is greater than, the total is greater than the sum of the parts. And you imagine two utilities next to each other. It is very frequent that when you improve a transmission line in one place, it affects the flow of power several hundred miles away. So the system is a network. If the improvement is needed just over the line in the next utility, for instance, if it's the improvements needed in Santee Cooper in order to help the flow of power in Duke territory, Duke won't pay for it, right? And vice versa. So it's very frequent that the optimal transmission solution is in somebody else's territory, or maybe they each benefit 50%. In the Southeast, we have no way to effectively get those synergies. And so when the emergency comes, our transmission system is still balkanized. So there's both market operations and planning functions that are effectively missing in a large part of the country, where the extreme cold events have a particular impact for a couple of reasons. We have a lot more electric heat in the Northeast. And in California, there's a lot of non-electric heat, but here we're majority electric heat. And this is true nationally, but particularly in the Southeast, we're much more reliant on natural gas now than we were 10 or 20 years ago. The role of natural gas as a power generation source has dramatically increased. And so these natural gas supply problems, which could be as far away as Pennsylvania or Texas, are tripping us up now when this new weather hits a region with a very high penetration of electric heat.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Unless we have a final question from a journalist, we might wrap since we've gone a bit over time. We've enjoyed this discussion with you. We really appreciate the analysis that Simon, did I hear a question? Sorry.
Hey, Chris. No, I just wanted to mention real quick. I put a couple things in the chat about somebody was asking kind of what's next. And we do have a couple of things I wanted to mention outside of North Carolina, but related to all of this, as we saw, they're all interrelated. So on February 2nd, the Georgia Public Service Commission is meeting, and we expect this to be a topic of discussion. And so they'll have Georgia Power representatives there, and this will probably be discussed. We don't know exactly what that will look like, but stay tuned. We've also heard this internal review that TVA is doing. We've heard that they're likely to finish that before their next board meeting, which is February 16th. We're not yet sure if or what from that is going to be made public, but we'll try and share that out too, as we're learning more around that time frame.
Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, and to follow up from that, so the FERC-NERC investigation, the previous FERC-NERC investigations have usually taken quite some time, and I wouldn't be surprised if this investigation doesn't wrap up. If it were to wrap up in the fourth quarter of this year, that's probably when it would be anticipated to do it. But both MISO and PJM have been collecting data, and they have meetings constantly where they provide updates to their members, and those meetings are often publicly available for folks to attend. And so I know MISO's provided some information, and we'll be providing more information as time goes on. But stay tuned for more information from the RTOs.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's probably a great point at which to wrap. We know it was a very serious problem. We're lucky that we did not have the same problem that Texas had, where over 200 people died in a very similar situation. And we hope to help the utilities here avoid a situation like that in the future, since we've had a couple of near misses. We'd be happy to follow up on individual questions with reporters to our organizations. And again, I want to thank our co-hosts and thank all of you for taking the time to discuss this with us. Take care.
Recording stopped.